Welcome to Conversations. If we're doing it right, this will be the first show that airs this Sunday. My guest tonight is Joel Baird. Joel and I are old friends, and I figured if I invited him to do the opening show, we could probably kill a lot of birds with one stone, since our lives overlap in several different areas. First one is you work
I'm ready
with
to kill
MCAT.
birds.
You're ready to kill birds. You work for MCAT, and you've helped get this show going. And I know you want to encourage people to use MCAT, so let's talk a bit about MCAT and what it
how
does.
it works and all that.
And then you can ask me questions about my show and what it's going to be like. So
Oh yeah, that might give like
kind
a,
of kill
a
another bird in there,
to
yes.
what's going on. Well, how MCAT works.
Right.
I'll rehearse this for you, but also for the people who may be watching. MCAT began here in Missoula in 1990, as a physical presence, but really it was worked on for a super long time by people in town. What they were trying to do was get the city to recognize that they could charge a fee for using the cable lines that go in alleyways, street corners, and so on, that cable companies were making a fair amount of money on. So the city was supplying cable companies with the means of producing a big income, yet not receiving any kind of in-kind services for this. And then coupled with the fact that, well, think of like pre-cable Missoula and how many information outlets there were. There were very few, but the importance of those outlets being local was really strong. That the technology of communication that was in town really reflected the needs and the activities of the town. So another impulse people had was not only to collect money from cable companies that were bringing a plethora of various media into the town that was reflecting maybe the world at large, the national scene, whatever, but to preserve in a list of 60 channels. And in that forum, at least have one outpost, perhaps, that people could use the medium of television, but address their individual concerns. So that was kind of the mix. It was kind of the intent, create a public forum that people could use for fairly narrow concerns or really broad concerns, that it wasn't a judgmental situation where you say, well, this is the broadest possible interest and we'll do a triage of projects related to that. The idea of cable access in a community is kind of first and foremost is to provide like a reflective property that people could come in and talk about things they want to talk about, present points of view, have fun with the channel, all these other elements. So here's how MCAT started. These people kind of pioneering in the mid-70s wanted the city of Missoula to follow trends other larger cities had undertaken, and that was to say to the cable companies, gee, you're making a lot of money using our right-of-ways and using the services we maintain so you can sling this cable around. We would like you to put a little money back into the community, 5% of the gross profit, and that at least a sizable, significant portion of that would go into creating this public access channel that kind of operates on a three-mission outlook. And it's often referred to as PEG, which is public, educational, and governmental. So, for instance, the show we are doing right now is part of the public access arm of this PEG notion. Then we also sponsor here an artist in residence that does media training in all the 3 city high schools year-round. And that generates a lot of interest in the educational area. They also train teachers who then use television production to a limited extent in each of the 3 high schools as part of a media curriculum. And the governmental part, it has always sort of been awaiting more enthusiasm perhaps on the part of the city that there would be a part-time government access coordinator. In any event, though, we have more lately been more sensitive to the government's needs. And so we have always cablecast the city council meetings. In some instances, special presentations that were of greater interest. But we've just started a program where we'll actually donate. It's kind of like the organization is going to donate a percentage of staff time to doing directly assisted programs. And of those, it could be a government program as well. So yeah, I've been doing this job not very long. I have associated with MCAT for a long time. I was on the board when it first began. I worked as an artist in the schools doing that teaching. And then only in the last it'll be probably 2 years in May, have I been, working in this trench, as it were.
Well, through you, I became aware that it was possible to do something like this. And my idea was that as a gay person who's done other things in the community, this was a different way of getting out certain kinds of messages and to do that kind of local focus that you were talking about. Within the gay movement, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on what happens nationally or even on the state. But quite often, there's a weakness at the bottom of building grassroots organization.
I think partly because people feel in a local manner maybe a little more vulnerable, for one thing.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Yeah, because they kind of think, well, I don't know if I want to be on the show locally and be identified as gay or lesbian locally. That seems like such a big, and it is. I don't mean to undermine, the sensibility somebody might have about that. So I think you're right. Typically, a community might take in, if you think of it as individual members, they'll take in a national magazine like The Advocate, which would give you the plain brown wrapper if you so chose, and so on. Discretionary mailing. I think the internet has done a lot in small communities that way too, but that is a much more privatistic form of communication than this would be. And I think another aspect of that, and it's kind of built into the thrill of having control over local media, is that media, in the sense of TV, movies, that kind of thing, it's kind of like a form of sculpture. Because sculpture takes a big effort. It seems like sculpture has to come out of a consensus of effort within the community and stuff like that. So it seems kind of like having a TV program. There's something kind of thrilling about that because you're getting a hold of the big public forum, or kind of a forum that seems to be reserved for people of importance or people of power. So it's kind of a different take on that equation, where you have kind of the thrill of doing that.
Well, I want to do some of that, but I also want to do some public figures, but as part of my show, I'd like to just get ordinary, people, friends of mine who have a interesting job or a different point of view, and so that we're not always focusing on big issues and or organizations here in town. So MCAT is really like a big soapbox.
It is like a big soap
probably
opera
that too, from what I understand.
Good
but,
Lord. What's the truth?
It's a soapbox. If people want to do what I'm doing, they can come to MCAT and set up their own show.
Right. And I guess, the phrase like soapbox is kind of apt in a way because you're kind of talking about, someone declaiming to a harried public something as they're kind of moving about. It does seem more and more that the commodity that is in technological cultures is attention. That's the hardest thing you can get a hold of. Let's say this program is going on, right? It's being taped now. It's going to be running Sunday night, maybe again and again, who knows? Maybe several years in the future it could be reruns. When somebody is channel surfing through all those channels, they kind of stop and say, what is this? They can't contextualize it as fast as they can contextualize a cartoon or a different kind of talk show. Oh, there's, Bill or, Johnny Carson, whatever, that kind of thing. So there's a real different element to it.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. I said this is our first show, but we already have 5 shows that we've done in the can, and we'll be showing those shows in the weeks to come. We have Peter Shober from my church. We have Brad Good from the health department, lady from my church who has a gay daughter, the mother of a transgender boy, and the executive director of the Missoula AIDS Council have already done shows with us. So those will be coming up.
Right. And you like this conversational format. I mean, that was kind of your intention, was not to have the programming be about organizations necessarily, and not kind of taking things in large chunks, but kind of through individual people and, just sitting down and talking with them. You're going to show, attempt to explore a number of issues. Like I know you've mentioned to me that you didn't want to have a show that was just about the gay, lesbian, transgendered issue, so that this was the only fulcrum from which you would lift any enlightenment at all. And I think, from what I've seen of the shows, you're doing that.
Well, quite often, any group sort of preaches to the choir and doesn't present itself to as well, perhaps to other people as it does to itself. And you have gay magazines, gay, what am I trying? Magazines, newspapers, but you don't have as much that actually presents the gay community to the straight community.
Oh, right.
and works
It's like
with
it's
that.
considered a specialization.
Right.
You know, like jokes just for plumbers.
And, well, sort of.
Right.
So what I would like to do is to have gay guests, straight guests, guests who are discussing issues of gay interest, but also issues of interest just to the community, as to everyone,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and not put so much emphasis on who is gay as a guest or who isn't, but what it is that they've come to talk about, and leave a lot of leeway as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think you have really done that. I mean, it's an interesting point of view. I know when you had some trial conversations in here with Andy, you guys had talked about a little bit about, the notion of urban centers as kind of providing an opportunity for real insular substrata existence, of any minority, stigmatized or not, that you could live in a Chinese neighborhood, a black neighborhood, a gay neighborhood, and so on. And that one of the interesting and probably challenging facets of our semi-rural life here is that there's not as much opportunity to get that insular anyway. There's just not the sheer number of people to provide that. And I always think the urban experience is kind of funny in the sense that you imagine extraordinary numbers of people are coming together in a really large place in order to ignore an extraordinary amount of other people so they can find the few people that they actually want to relate to. So, you can be a part of any super specialized interest group, and you say, okay, I'm living in a city of 5 million people because here there are 10,000 people I really want to know, potentially. So I agree with what you guys were talking about in terms of the experience of rural or semi-rural life, like Missoula, like its surrounding area, being a real interesting time and place for gay, lesbian people to inhabit like that.
I lived in the San Francisco area for 14 years before I came back here. And I lived in a neighborhood where you could, say, work in a gay business, go to a gay restaurant. There was a theater in the area. You could pretty much live in that little area. And that was good for the gay movement, I think, to have that phase where you concentrated, you kind of worked out your politics and your approaches to things. But it really was limiting, I felt. And I really think that the next stage is for a lot of us to go back to our hometowns, to really sort of spread the word across the nation and to get away from this idea that gay is something that exists in little pockets in the big city, that it's somewhere else. And to start getting people in small towns to come out and to integrate, really, and to have communities like Missoula that are tolerant and open and where people can be themselves. And I hope this TV show will do something along that.
I think people's sense of it is kind of like a notion of critical mass, because you could characterize, depending on one's experience, you could characterize Missoula as, open and tolerant or whatever, or for other individuals, it could be characterized as hell on earth, depending, on what circumstances they are in. But maybe it takes that sense of critical mass, like you say, any stigmatized group could band together in a city to get a sense of identity and its own power, because maybe it feels totally powerless. And I like this notion you're bringing up of something being kind of like evolutionary in that sense, that the people have to create first a strong sense of community in a large urban area. And as is not, I have never felt that urban areas were any more tolerant than smaller areas.
No.
It's just that people feel more helpless. It's like, oh, fags are kissing on the subway. Well, there's nothing I can do about that. So I choose to ignore it because it's too much trouble. I feel powerless. There's too many people, too much stuff going on to really crack down on them. Whereas the option is always open in a smaller place, to feel that sense of control that the mainstream group could exercise over the smaller group. So it's kind of funny, like I think of Missoula as being semi-rural, as I mentioned, that it's kind of in a tippling spot where it's kind of large enough to be characterized as tolerant or whatever.
Well, I'm not sure those distinctions mean much anymore with the internet and the way we're going. As We had someone for a men's group I was in who kept talking about rural, and finally I just lost my temper and pointed out that we had people who had lived in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, that they had access to television and newspapers. The missionaries still came through, and that, this was a pretty sophisticated group that he was dealing with. This was,
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you in that sense. Like, I would never make, as I say, that kind of distinction between urban and rural, where I would automatically think the more rural or the less densely populated any community was, the more totalitarian, the dumber the people, so on and so forth. I would never make that assumption. I mean, I think that, as I say, what I thought might be in place is some kind of social mechanism where if the mainstream feels as though it has enough power to exercise it, it will over any minority that's there, whether or not there's an easy way of hurting or condemning a minority or somehow stigmatizing them. That's just going to happen, just as a strange matter of human nature. I think there's like a psychology experiment that was done some years ago, kind of like the Milgram tests. If people would under suggestion believe they're shocking a subject to death even. But this one was people were instructed, stooges were instructed to be sick on a subway. And they would be sick on the subway with different amounts of people on the subway. So when the subway car was filled, it either took much longer for anyone to offer them assistance or no one offered them assistance at all. And as the subway car became smaller, the faster and more sure the response of assistant was to the feigned sickness. So there were 10 people, someone would kind of come right over, but it became 30 or more. They think, well, somebody else will take care of it, or I just trust this sickness. It's not a real thing, it's some ruse or something, I don't know. So that kind of thing, I think, goes on. That kind of mechanism kind of obtains.
You and I are also connected through the Crystal Theater, which means a great deal to me. I had a hand in starting Outspoken here, and in the first issue, we had an article on the Crystal Theater because I thought it was so important for the city and for the gay community as well. After that, you became one of the people who was trying to save the Crystal Theater.
Right, reconfigure it.
Yeah,
anyway,
would you like
into
to talk
something
about what happened there?
Well, heck, in hell's bells. Sometimes I do think that it was a sheer act of nostalgia or something on my part. Where I kind of felt that the theater had such a long history, and I kind of romanticized that history too, for a variety of reasons, that I just wanted to see it going on a purely sentimental level. And I struggle with this issue of whether or not the impulse, to put all this effort into it is based on that, or is based on a sense of saving a community resource, and it really is. And of course, I think anyone that is working in a nonprofit organization, a service nonprofit organization, has that feeling that sometimes you feel you're completely ignored and out of your mind, that you're tilting at windmills with this. But in any event, yeah, that happened, that when the business, the Crystal Video and the Crystal Theater split up, Tam Armstrong and I had decided to make the Crystal Theater part into a nonprofit activity that was going to try to enlarge its scope of activity maybe beyond just exhibiting films like that. And then part of our mission was to raise the dollars to bring in films that might be of smaller interest to smaller groups of people, gay and lesbian, among people interested in foreign language, people interested in different cultures, people interested in reflecting their own history, too, on the screen.
Mongolian throat singing.
Right, exactly.
We had a film like that recently.
And I think, again, it kind of overlaps with television activity, that making a TV show or film is often seen as something only the powerful can do. So I like the notion of the Crystal Theater responding to the smaller, independent, more marginal film, that it's showing that people can have a greater voice using technology to communicate with each other.
In case there's people out there who don't know, the Crystal Theater is a very small theater, just across the bridge on Higgins, across from Missoulian, and it features foreign language films, independent films, films of special interest to to Montanans or to gay people or whatever.
And we also try to have us at least be open to community presentations by foregoing showing matinees on Saturday and Sunday, time when people are out about, or you can access an audience that you want to. We've left those Saturday, Sunday afternoons open every week for people to rent the theater at a really low cost, so that attempts at theater, concerts, lectures that people maybe wouldn't take on because of the high cost of putting these things on, so they could find an opportunity there of doing those. And we've been trying, along with those films, to try to present an educational component to it as well, that we could have discussion groups, background in the calendar that we publish every other month.
Well, my experience at the theater has been that you guys will try most anything.
I mean, there's a cautionary element to it as well, because unlike the TV channel time here, for instance, which is really generous, 24 hours with a very low overhead, there is a real high overhead to running that theater. So sometimes we do have to make choices between what seems like, even in our small special interest world, is going to be financially successful compared to something that's going to be new, shocking, and potentially really different. Mm-hmm. So that kind of thing goes on. I think right now the Crystal's in a position of maybe 25, no, I'd go lower. 20% of the cost of running that theater is provided by grants and donations. A much larger percentage, though, if I include all that volunteer labor. So I think it would be up to 25%. So the ticket cost falls that much short of the actual cost of making the whole venture go.
Well, you and Tam originally thought that you could provide maybe a living for yourselves.
Oh, yeah. We were quickly disabused of that notion.
Which was silly, of course. Now you're the president of the board, I believe.
Right. I'm the uncompensated president.
And you and I volunteer on Thursday nights.
Yeah.
Either one of us get paid. There are lots of volunteers at the theater and lots of volunteers that are needed.
That's quite true. So if people are watching us and they want to call 728-5748 to register an interest in volunteering, they certainly can. And it is a fun job, mind you. I mean, it's had an extraordinary response rate in the world of volunteerism, but it is pretty fun. Sell tickets.
Oh, I can't work down there.
Watch the movie, sell tickets.
Without seeing people I know coming through. And
yeah. I mean, that sense of community there is kind of fun, too. And I think, it's something one has to do, just as you are trying with this television series to bridge outside of a smaller circle of concern, perhaps, or, at least the degree of concern of gay and lesbian issues, and try to see how those are just simply enmeshed in the social contract at large anyway. I think it is a real challenge to any group, whether they're institutional group like the Crystal, or, there's just like gay and lesbian folk wandering around Missoula, to strike a balance between seeing the world, in a much smaller sense, and then becoming broad enough to allow other people into whatever dialogue or activity that is going on. So, and that's a thing to watch against, I mean, I see it at the Crystal where people might say that they find it elitist, because its positioning is behind the Bridge restaurant, that its signage isn't really ecstatic, that we can't afford to advertise every day. So it seems like it's more a private club, and I hope it never becomes that,
Well, I was going to say that I was scared of it for years.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that.
It seemed somehow that, well, you must have to be a member of something, or because they're showing all these exotic films from China and India, and I don't know, it didn't quite look like a theater, and it took me quite a while to wander in and find out that all you had to do is pay your money and watch a film, and that was all there was to it.
You felt like it had to be underwritten
I don't know why,
by
but I thought it must be something
yearly tithe
kind of exotic, and there is that atmosphere about that theater, though.
The exoticism.
Well, the clubbish thing, in a sense.
I guess you're right. I mean, partly because it runs on such a high level of volunteers.
Well, and you got the point where it couldn't afford advertising in the Missoulian.
Yeah.
And so the only place you can see it in the newspaper is once a week in
Friday Entertainer.
In the Entertainer.
Or in the weekly Missoula Independent.
Oh.
So it's kind of, at least it's in their publishing rhythm, the size of our pocket.
So you do sort of have to know that it's there.
There's that aspect, and we are trying so many other aspects of trying to keep people apprised of what's going on, like starting an email list that people have been slow to join when it was more difficult. So it made it easier, and I'm getting a lot more requests, so the list is growing. We also send announcements to KUFM university and community activities. So weekly they're able to announce what the schedule is going to be. And then of course we produce a calendar which outlines all the films 8 weeks in advance, though there can be lots of changes and kind of rearrangements of that calendar.
But you have to be part of the club to get the calendar, so.
Well,
A little bit.
3,000 are inserted in
Yeah.
the independent each month.
I know.
Available, anyone will pick that up.
And we need volunteers to help fold them as well.
And distribute them.
Right. The theater, besides doing movies, you mentioned other things that it does. When we started the gay and lesbian town meetings, my first thought was the theater, and you guys provided a place for them and have ever since. And it isn't just for gay things as well. There are all kinds of groups that meet there that
Oh, sure.
have special showings.
Right. I mean, I think that is, there's any number of things you could read about, stigmatized minorities. But one of them is this enlargement effect. If anything, in a group of things that are very, very similar, if anything is dissimilar, it's just like an optical or perceptual delusion that people get that it's a lot larger than it is. So someone could say, let's say you have a fairly heterogeneous skin color community, and 5 people with brown skin move in the community, and they're located in different places. And then you might find a neighbor saying, there's a lot of brown skin people moving in here, when actually there's just 5, and every time they see them, they don't recognize that they're seeing a different group. I say this just to segue into a Crystal anecdote, because when we had first made the theater nonprofit and we're soliciting funds and so on, we also were soliciting advice from a lot of people, like, how should we do this? How does this work? What do you think is better? And let's say when Jace Laxo owned the theater, the Gay and Lesbian Film Festival was held there from 1987 to 1997. That's 10 years every year it was held there. And if there was a gay lesbian film, we would book it if it seemed like it could at least support itself, if it was that quality. So, because sometimes gay and lesbian filmmaking could be too cerebral or too, at one time, before it became kind of part of the Hollywood pastiche, of figures to offer. Anyway, the story I'm getting to was asking the advice of someone who was a professional ad person like that. And he said, what I think could be, and this was somebody who grew up in San Francisco, who was very progressively identified and so on, maybe mid-50-ish, and said, something that could be really hurting is people are talking about how you have all this gay and lesbian programming down here. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is he talking about? Because it had taken a 10-year history doing that very same thing. But I think the trigger for it was, I was doing it, and people said, oh, that's the gay guy who's running the theater now. So it enlarged the perception of the theater enormously, actually.
Right.
I mean, enormously that someone, progressive would say, maybe you better stop doing some of that stuff in order to get more money.
One of the ironies is Jace, who owned the place and who now owns the video store, was very conscious that there was gay money there and had no qualms about booking films, renting films.
Yeah, both on a financial and political level.
I did an article once where I mentioned that he wasn't gay, and he read it and said, well, you don't have to tell people that.
Right.
Because he realized that there was money to be made if people knew that he was sympathetic and supportive.
Oh, yeah. And that's part of what I'm saying, the critical mass of a community, though, because that's what you might see in a large city is some kind of financial clout or whatever. And maybe that's what, as I've told you in the past, I feel like Missoula has grown, just physically it's grown enough so that gay and lesbian groups have enough numbers or temerity in those numbers or financial impact to feel a little less fearful as they might have had in decades past and so on.
Well, I think we have the numbers. The question is, as you say, whether or not people are willing to come out.
Yeah, and it's still, I think it is a more, well, I think it's ridiculous in a way for me to say I think it's a more laden issue in a less populous place than but people always say they feel more anonymous in a city, and the people that like that gravitate towards a city to get that feeling.
Well, and an irony there is that when I lived in San Francisco, of course, everybody came from every place else and felt so liberated and free. And one day I ran into someone who was a native, and he didn't want to be seen going into Castro for fear that someone, that his parents knew might be that.
He had that familial ball and chain.
Yeah, we thought it was such a free place, but it was our illusion. It was sort of a
Right.
tourist thing that
Everyone had reinvented themselves there.
Yeah, well, people from all over the world were coming because it was such a free place, but people who live there, well, I don't know, my folks might see me go into that part of town, and,
Well, that is an odd aspect. I wonder, at one time, when I was a younger feller, it seemed like people really didn't want to talk about where they were from. You ask someone where they're from, I wouldn't, but maybe Sean would. He would say, ask these direct questions. But it seemed like I was noticing more and more people say, well, I'm from all over, I kind of lived here, I kind of lived there. And it always seems like people have to leave their hometown to feel like they've gone through some transition to adulthood, or a lot do. And a lot of people don't want to pinpoint themselves because they feel like the place they came from might define them too strongly, or I don't know what. I mean, there's a number of things, I guess. If people felt like they were foolish when they were a teenager, they might not like their hometown because it reminded them of how dumb they felt when they were young.
Well, I think for a lot of young people, the idea is that it's happening somewhere else. It's happening out there.
Yeah.
We can go to someplace big, and there'll be different kinds of people, and then if you do that, or I suppose not everybody, but I felt that it was time to come back to a place that really had a lot to offer, that I was raised, that that there were just as good people here as there were there. There were just as tolerant people here, and besides, I missed the whole variety of young people, old people.
Interesting, because you felt your urban experience was that the age groups were highly divided into their activity levels. For instance, everyone
I hardly ever
was
saw
divided
children.
into
I
their
hardly
activity
ever saw
levels.
children.
Huh.
Go weeks without seeing children. Maybe from a distance, as you're on the trolley or something. But
well, it's kind of like, it's so funny what you're saying, because there's like a reverse sense of variety. Like my sister-in-law, Kelly, who had just decided to move to Missoula several months back, said, oh, I don't know if I can stand to live here. It's just so white in Missoula. And so she felt like it was lacking, different heritage characteristics, that it seemed too homogenous and limiting to her for that reason. So it's kind of funny.
Well, Joel, let's see, should we plug anything else?
We plugged the Crystal.
Oh.
We plugged MCAT.
Christo, you can give money, of course.
Yeah, it is a nonprofit.
But I keep insisting that you can really support the Crystal by going to the movies.
Well, heck yeah.
And buying the popcorn.
Yeah.
And enjoying yourself. And
well, sure. I mean, the most well-rounded thing, of course, the ideal of anyone having a nonprofit organization is that people donate time and money and be interested in its activities. But sometimes you get a variety of that. People that don't come very much give a lot of money because they feel like they should. And people who come all the time don't have the money because they spent it, using the service.
And some of us just volunteer because we had no money, and it's a way
It's a nice
to
way to
see
see
free
the movie.
movies and
Yeah.
hang out with your friends. Let's see, covered MCAT.
Yeah, and the
Okay.
Crystal.
I am thrilled that you'd be my first guest, or
I
first
am
guest for
honored
publication.
to be so.
We will, in weeks to come, be showing some of these shows that we've already done. They're a little more amateurish. I didn't realize that you couldn't click your glasses against your microphone on one
sure.
show and things like that. But
Like
we're going
a
to run them
learning
anyway
experience.
because I think the conversations were interesting.
And you have your time slot.
Right. So we
Yes.
will be on on Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
10 o'clock, weekly.
Right.
So please come, join us. Maybe you can even be on the show.
feel free to stop if you get stuck or whatever.
Okay.
The tape runs for 2 hours.
Hello.
Oh, jeez.
Okay, welcome to Conversations this afternoon. My guest is Peter Shober. Peter Shober is the pastor at the University Congregational Church. I'm a member there, I should say. I have been for about 3 years. Peter's been very helpful in gay causes here in town, but today I just want to talk to him about his life, his family, what it's like to be a minister in the year 2000. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with what prompted you to become a minister?
Long story.
Well, the short version.
Short version is, I always think of the line Walter Mondale had when he was elected vice
We're
president.
dating ourselves.
Well, when he was elected
Okay.
vice president, somebody said, "Why would you ever want to be a vice president?" And he said, "Well, it's good indoor work without a lot of lifting." That's the short version. Long version, trying to make it short. You know, I guess I sensed that I, you know, searched and searched for a God to love, but was found by a God that loved me. And that changed my life. You know, I was, as a young man, active in the peace movement, in the Vietnam era. Discovered when I was in college that I loved theology. Went overseas, I guess trying to find myself as a young person, and was exposed to some very religious people in India. And I hadn't ever been exposed to that, and I didn't agree with them, with their theology or the way they ordered their lives. But they really made me think about what I did believe. It's easy as a person to know what you disagree with, but sometimes it's hard to know what you passionately can assert and believe in. And so ended up being a religion major at the college I attended. Knew by the end of that time that I needed to see what seminary was about. And I think during those years in seminary, gradually just felt a call to the ordained parish ministry. And was ordained in 1984, and that's 16 years ago.
Well, Congregationalists are a fairly liberal group. Did you feel drawn to that kind of liberalism, or how did you pick a denomination?
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating thing just in general. How do we end up being what we are? You know, is it a birthright or is it an intentional choice? And I think in my case it was a little bit of both. I moved around quite a bit in my life. My father was a railroader and grew up, was baptized, I understand, in a Lutheran church, was brought up in a Methodist church in Seattle. We moved back to the Twin Cities. The neighborhood church was a Congregational church and started attending there. And then as I got more involved in peace and justice issues as a young person, I remember being flabbergasted when I discovered that the denomination that I was a part of then had such a legacy of peace and justice work. And, you know, is that a coincidence or is that the way it works? I don't know. But, you know, the congregational tradition is a tradition that is steeped in all kinds of justice-based commitments, be it the abolitionist movement or the ordination of women or rights for gay and lesbian people. It's just sort of who that tradition has been about. And I have found my home with that. And I don't know if I found that home or if that home found me, but it's where I live.
You know, I'd like to go into this a bit. I stumbled into the church in a somewhat similar way. I don't know whether it found me or I found it, but I was invited to go and started going more and more regularly and liked the people. And then the other things sort of fell in line afterwards. I didn't realize until just recently that the Congregationalists go back to the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think of them as staunchly moralistic and staunchly pro-Jesus, if you can use that term. the short answer of how you get from that to this very liberal stance that the Congregationalists have today.
Yeah, and we do come from that. You know, the lineage is with the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock. A few years after they landed, the Puritans, which were a separate group, landed in that area. They realized that it would be easier to coexist together than it would be to live separately. And that coming together of a couple of different groups created what we now know as Congregationalism. And you're right, that was a very, very severe theological context that they created for themselves. Part of that is the time in which they lived. You know, that was a remarkable time for religious fervor. And these people left England not only for religious freedom, but because they were going to create the city on top of the hill, the New Jerusalem. And you know, that was a wonderful energy that had a downside too. And then how it changed, I think, was just a story of America. You know, they tended not to be the Tories in the Revolutionary War. Were very involved in that whole march to freedom in the creation of our country. Got involved very early on, early 19th century, with the abolitionist movement. And that was a defining movement in the American church. And there was a terrific division surrounding that. And Congregationalists tended to be very involved in the abolitionist movement. And that led from one thing to another, along with a theological freedom. Congregationalists have always maintained a non-doctrinal stance. We don't hold doctrine. We live as a covenantal people instead. But it's kind of an anomaly in American religious history because we're a free church, like the Baptists are a free church. Most of the free churches have tended towards a more conservative theological stance. The Congregationalists have always tended towards a more liberal one. Certainly you can find lots of liberal Baptists and you can find a lot of conservative Congregationalists, but those are the tendencies.
Well, it surprised me coming into the church because I assumed that everyone in the church was very gung-ho on God and Jesus, and that I was the only doubter there. And as I spent more and more time, I found that there were a lot of people like me in that church who were there for other reasons. I shouldn't say that, other reasons, but for whom other reasons were very important. The sense of community being one of them, the sense of, for me especially as a gay person, you tend to see a very limited segment of people if you hang out only with gay people. And for me, that church has been wonderful in the sense that I see older people, and I see people being born and brought into church for the very first time. And like Callan's 2 now, and talks and walks and carries on. And that is really exciting. It gives me a whole sense of life there. I wanted to talk to you about what it's like to be a minister in this day and age. When I was a young minister, had to be Simon Pure, didn't want them to be divorced. They made house calls. There was a minister down around Hardin who spoke Crow in the morning, spoke English in the early afternoon. He ministered to my family. God, he married a whole bunch of them and buried a whole bunch of them. And I know that's not like that anymore, but what's it like? Did you get the thing that you're expected to be pure and wonderful and upright because you are the minister? People watch their language around you, that sort of thing?
Well, I guess I never got that. But I don't come from a family of preachers. You know, my family of origin went to church, but, you know, certainly not excessively. And, you know, that wasn't anything I thought about until I was in college. And I didn't really have a lot of preconceptions about who preachers were or what that implied. It was sort of walking into a strange place. And I think being a pastor today is, it's strange. it's not a common occupation, at least amongst the the social groupings that I've been around in my life. You know, it used to be in America that, and this sort of reflects the sexist time, but it used to be in America that the bright young man would go into medicine, law, or ministry. And I think in the course of a generation, you can kind of drop the ministry out of that. You know, there's a shortage, an emerging shortage of people who are willing to go into ministry. In the mainline, more liberal Protestant denominations, had it not been for the emergence of women being ordained, we would really be struggling for pastors.
I know the Catholics have a problem finding priests, but you're saying the Protestant denominations as well find?
Well, the Catholics have had a more difficult time than we have. Our problem with that is more recent. You know, clearly Roman Catholic Church has a terrific clergy shortage. It varies from place to place, but they're doing a lot of creative things in terms of lay ministry. We're starting to do that too. The church is in the midst of some remarkable change, and I think change from within itself, and change because of how the world is changing. You know, it's a remarkable time to be a person of faith.
You say the church, and I know when you're making that switch, but sometimes you're talking about the church as all of the churches, and then sometimes you're talking about our church. Just there, I think you were talking about church with the capital C, with the big church. There is that movement towards ecumenism. Ecumenism.
Yeah.
Already this denomination has merged with others. How far do you think this can go? Or can you see it going in, let's say in our lifetime? Or
Yeah, I think it's really coming along. And I think it's coming along because it's an idea that has come of age. And I think it's really happening because, you know, necessity becomes the mother of invention. Churches are in radical change right now. Downsizing, you know, becoming larger, becoming less set, more flexible, all kinds of things are going on. And we also live in a time that many people describe as being post-Christian, meaning that America is becoming so obviously pluralistic, religiously, socially, in all kinds of ways, that the church cannot assume or claim the authority that it has had in years past, which makes all of us want to work together more. Now, it also means that you have more people sort of living within, you know, sort of a protected enclave. You know, there's a siege mentality, and you can feel real clannish. But, you know, most people today don't lift up doctrine or dogma as being all that important to them. They're looking for a community of people that they feel fed by, that they can feed into, where there's a sense of welcome and authenticity, a sense of truth-telling. And what the name of that might be is largely, I think, unimportant to most people. So,
you know, you're the spiritual leader of our congregation, I suppose. Hope that doesn't embarrass you. I have trouble with that word spiritual because people say they're spiritual, and I'm not sure what that means. But you're also an employee of a nonprofit business of sorts. How do you rationalize those two? I mean, you have very clear-cut duties in one sense on that, and I should say I volunteer in the church one day a week, and I see you behind the scenes, and you do all kinds of other things. Would you care to deal with that issue of what it's like being, in a sense, an employee and, in a sense, the leader?
yeah. Well, I think it's one of the reasons that being a pastor is strange. In one way, maybe we're the last profession that's genuinely for the generalist. You do a little bit of everything. You know, you got to do administration, you do your preaching, you do your worship preparation, you lead worship, weddings and funerals, but you do a lot of counseling, you do a lot of teaching. You realize after a couple years that maybe what you do most of is deal with interruptions. That interruptions are, you know, where the ministry really happens. And so it's difficult work to fully describe. And I think I, you know, feel the tension of being an employee of the church, yet I also am called to lead people in their faith journeys, to encourage them. Now, as a spiritual leader, I guess I really don't see myself up in front of the pack, you know, pulling them along. I see myself more being with the pack of people and, you know, trying to encourage all of us to walk on, you know, to walk on out of whatever captivities we might be experiencing into freedom, into some sense of the promised land, and getting folks to share their stories and to tell the truth, to get away from, you know, this remarkably superficial society that we live in, where, you know, we seem to be guided by, you know, consumerism as much as we're guided by anything else.
Along these lines, I might say that our church also is working with a shared ministry, we call it,
Mm-hmm.
where people in the congregation do more than used to be expected of them.
Yeah.
I said I volunteer on Thursdays. I do the back page of the church program, and answer the phone. And people come in at various times, and I've been asked to speak on HIV, and other people got up and told their stories in the church. And so our conception within the church is changing just in the time that I have been going there.
Yeah.
You seem to like that, the idea of working with the congregation as opposed to being the man
Yeah.
who does everything.
Well, I think organizations, institutions everywhere are becoming less hierarchical, are becoming less static based, more dynamic. They are, by necessity, becoming more flexible and less rigid. They are becoming more relational. Instead of having all of these strict distinctions between the roles of people. And what we call shared ministry, I think, can go by a number of different names, but essentially what we're trying to embody is that notion that says we're no longer living in a time when people are going to essentially purchase ministry to be done on their behalf. They're not simply paying me to go out and do things for them. We're recognizing that if church is to be real, if faith is to become something of meaning, all of us have to find our own ministry. And it's my job to try to encourage people to discern where and what in their life represents a calling for them. And then once they have a sense of that, how can I help them to be equipped to do that ministry? And so we share these ministries together. And, you know, some terrific things can happen with that. You know, it's like this, this book that we've put together, different stories of different people in the church being willing to lift up, you know, their own stories of brokenness, their deepest yearnings for hope, recognizing that as we share our stories, we're drawn into the deeper parts of who we are, which then encourages us to think about, you know, how are we called to do ministry in the midst of community? How can I be a person that goes beyond my own, you know, desires, my own fears, all of that, and to be in community, sharing a vision, you know. And I would hope that the vision we share is a vision of compassion, of peace, of welcoming of the stranger, of being able to celebrate our differences and instead of just trying to create a conformity. It's you know, every church is interesting. Every church is loaded with all kinds of different people. But I think in some unique ways, University Congregational is sort of a particular place for a lot of religious refugees. A lot of people that come from different places who are seeking a more open community to express their faith. And you know, hopefully we're going to be lifting that up in less of a spectator-based approach and more of a participative approach.
I always find it interesting is what is said before communion. Who can take communion? There are different churches now. In ours, the wording is,
When we're doing communion, when I say, you know, this table is open to anyone who desires or possesses a belief in Christ.
right.
Is
So
that-
if you
okay.
desire, some I've been, you have to be baptized, but not necessarily in their church. It's a variety there. Peter, you have a wife. You have 3 kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's your second wife. How does family deal with ministry? Is it, you know, there's the stereotype of the preacher's kid. Do your children feel that? Do you try to avoid having them feel like that?
We have 2 daughters and 1 son. Our daughters are 11 and 8, and our son is just turning 5, actually, this week. And I don't know how it is for them to be a preacher's kid. I don't have any illusions that it doesn't make any difference. I know that it does. They are under pressure because of that in changing ways. It's not the way it used to be, but it's still there. And I guess I really don't know any ministers who don't work crazy hours all the time, and you're always on call. You're always doing this and that, terrifically long work week. And in truth, the people that suffer that the most is your family. You know, they bear the brunt of that whole thing. So if there's one thing I feel badly about, you know, in terms of being in ministry, is the impact it has on my children, on my wife, my partner. And I need to, you know, recognize. I remember when I came to Missoula, my first sermon, I said, well, you know, my priorities in life are that, you know, God is the top priority, my wife is my second priority, my children is the third priority, and the church is the fourth priority. You know, which everybody applauds and sounds great. And I don't live up to that very well. You know, it's very, very easy.
I remember when your dog ran away. All of a sudden, he became he probably moved up there
Yeah.
somewhere between the kids and your wife or something.
No.
We have a friend, Andy, whose parents, his father was a minister. Now, they're from a different generation. I talked to his mother one time, and she wanted to marry a minister. That was her goal in life, and she gives tea parties, and she was a right-hand man to her husband, and they thought that their kids should grow up to be preachers' kids. That was quite natural. Your wife has a job of her own.
Sure.
If she were, well, I don't know, if she were of a different faith or if she weren't interested, would that make any difference? Maybe that's not the way to propose the question. I guess, how are the roles for the minister, you know, in a time of feminism and such?
Well, it has changed radically. And, you know, comparing my situation to the situation of Andy's family, you know, 30 years ago, and being in a much more conservative tradition, it's a little bit like apples and oranges. But I'm sure Barb, my wife, is just as amazed that she happens to be married to a clergy person as I am to find myself being a clergy person. This wasn't something I had planned out, and although I was clergy when she and I met, so she knew it was going to happen. But oftentimes, both Barb and I will say how grateful we are to what were typically women clergy ministers' wives in generations past who changed that what could be a very, very restrictive lifestyle for women who happen to be married to pastors. And Barb's life has always been informed by an involvement with feminism and the need for her to have her own identity and to pass that on to her daughters and our son. She isn't going to be stuck in any stereotype
No.
anyway.
But on
So-
the other hand, Barb is, what she does do for the church really works. I mean, I feel that she's really a part of the church life there,
Yeah.
even though she's not running all the groups and doing all this sort of thing. She's
Well, she's
certainly
incredible.
is there on the landscape and
She
and
loves
brightens,
people.
yeah.
And she's just got one of those personalities that, it's life-giving for her to be in the midst of a lot of people who are attempting to do good things. And she, by nature, is going to be involved in a lot of things, but she's also very good at only involving herself in the things that are going to be life-giving for her. And the church, thankfully, really respects that. They don't have an expectation that clergy partners, that it's a 2-for-1 deal. That day is sort of over, I think. But no, she loves the church too. That's the other part of it. She would always be a church person, I think, regardless of what I did. And she just happens to be one of those people that going to church is like a fish swimming in water. She would want to do it, and she, like most people, doesn't have a lot of tolerance for it when it isn't life-giving, when there isn't a passion, when
it isn't fun.
when it isn't fun,
Yeah.
and engaging and real. So
Well, let's, I don't know, justify the money you make at the church. Because as I say, I see you behind the scenes, and I see you doing things that people don't normally do. And I'm sometimes quite amazed. Let's go through some of those things you do. I know you go to ministerial association meetings. You bury the dead. You marry people. You have services weekly, sometimes more often than once, depending on the church season. You administer, do you administer the money? Are you in charge of doing the taxes?
No, I don't do that stuff, but you do a lot of administration. I mean, one of the ways to look at what a minister does, a clergy person does, the traditional description is that we are called to wear 3 hats: the prophetic hat, the priestly hat, and the pastoral hat. The prophetic hat is to embody the prophetic tradition of looking out upon the world and seeing where the injustice is, confronting that, being a force for compassion, and that sort of replicating that wonderful thing that Dorothy Day said, that the church should exist to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. The priestly hat is that which is usually referred to as what you do when you sort of are a functionary at worship, administering the sacraments, burying the dead, baptizing the babies, doing weddings, all of that. And the pastoral component is when you are there to be with people in their broken places, in their places of great joy and deep sorrow, to walk with your people, to be at the bedside in the hospitals, And so it's, you know, it's sort of schizophrenic. In an age of specialization, clergy really do a whole lot of different things. And I don't know if we do any of them spectacularly well, but I think we're trained to do a lot of things. You know, hopefully with a competency and a compassion and with some creativity. And but you know, gosh, you just do all kinds of different things. I remember one time trying to figure out, you know, how do I spend my time? And I wrote down all the categories of what I do. And I think there was, you know, 2-3 dozen different tasks that you do. That there's an ebb and a flow to that. You know you're going to be preaching, you know, every Sunday, and that's sort of the linchpin. And I figure about a quarter of my time goes into you know, sermon writing and worship planning and leading of worship.
How much of what you say and do is from your point of view, and how much is what you feel you owe the congregation as their leader? Is there any difference there?
You know, it's kind of a, it's a sort of a dance that you have every week. You know, when you preach, preaching really is kind of a unique form of communication. You know, it's not making a speech. When you're writing out a sermon, if you write them out, it isn't like writing a paper for school or something. It's odd language. And you need to speak out of your own heart, out of your own passion, your own knowledge. And you also need to speak out of your people's experience. So certainly you're speaking out of your own conscience, your own belief, but you're doing that in community. And sometimes you really wonder if what you're saying comes out of you or if it comes out of this collective experience that we have. And it's really kind of a mystery. I mean, people say, how do you know what you're going to preach on every week? And you know, I think most preachers, you know, you just open yourself up to the wonder of it all.
Peter, I want to, before we close, being a gay person, I really am convinced that the church has a role to play in this emergence of a gay culture and a gay identity. And I don't want to get into so much what you feel and what you've done. I want to get into the churches and how they work. Now, the Congregationalists, correct me if I'm wrong, we are an independent church, but we are affiliated with some national organization. Now, the national organization, I believe, has said that the denomination should be open and affirming of gay people, but it's up to the churches to decide individually. Now, am I correct in
That's right.
in doing that?
University Congregational Church is a part of the denomination called the United Church of Christ. And we're happen to be headquartered in Cleveland. We're not a large denomination. It's about 1.5 million people. In 1984, at what we call our General Synod, which is a gathering of representatives from all across the country, both clergy and lay. In 1984, you know, you vote on these different issues that come up, and a big issue that year was how we as a denomination respond to gay and lesbian people. So that General Synod voted itself to be open and affirming of gay and lesbian people, and came up with an invitation for individual local congregations to also declare themselves to be open and affirming. When you have a non-doctrinal free church tradition, the national people have no control over the local autonomy of each church. So there's no, you know, the national church can't tell the local church what they should or shouldn't believe. But because we are a covenantal people, it was, you know, it's been discerned over these these 20 years that this is a defining issue that's facing Christendom today. And the United Church of Christ very early on and very consistently has spoken out for gay and lesbian rights. And we in Missoula at this particular church entered into that issue and studied it for a long, long time. And then finally in 1993, we became an open and affirming church. Clearly every mainline denomination is embroiled in this issue. The United Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Disciples of Christ, the Lutherans, everybody is. And it will continue to define who we are in the Christian church.
Peter, I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Thank you very much for sharing your time this afternoon. If this show continues, I'd very much like to have you come back
Be fun.
and discuss some of these other issues more deeply.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Greg.